Welcome to our third lecture, Making a Meaning lecture by SCI-Arc faculty. In this case, it's an honor to introduce our current grad chair here at SCI-Arc. So he's going to be overlooking and masterminding a little bit of the outcome of our grad program for the next 5 years, I would say. If he doesn't get fired before. On the run. A couple of things. I think the title of the lecture that it was pretty much self-imposed, but still suits the character, is Architecture as Void. I think Hernan has embarked about like 10 years ago on an exploration of the void of the dark screen or the black screen for quite a few and a long time, and quite a few experiments that have come out of that. Always the work kind of compelling and inquisitive and out there, and so we're looking forward to seeing how he manages and wrestles the void and kind of what comes out of that potentially. So please welcome Hernan Diaz Alonso.
All right, I have to make a public announcement that I don't want lights, so it doesn't look like the tech guys and Reza fuck it up, but it was my choice. A couple of things of that. One is noon, so we need as dark as we can. Also, there's no gain in you guys be able to see me very much. So, first I have to say a couple of things. I hate lecturing at noon. I'm not really a morning person. So already that is difficult as a task to come and talk at noon. Second, when Alexis asked me to come and talk to you guys, I said yes. And then when he said, "Oh, you're going to talk about the void," and I said, "Okay, what the fuck is the void?" So a couple of things on that. First, I just want to say I really like making a meaning. I really like what making a meaning does for the culture of SCI-Arc, and I really like what, and we're very grateful to what Alexis does with the program and creating that kind of a condition for you guys to get excited about architecture. And the other thing, I really like how making a meaning run as an organization, and it's really my wet dream that the whole grad program will have that level of discipline and order. Eventually, guys, for those of you who will join us in the grad program, then it became more like a midnight mission, homeless home kind of thing. So I would like to encourage you to keep that sense of order and discipline that you learn in making a meaning. The other thing is I always feel ambivalent to talk to you guys, people in making a meaning, because I have to make this very clear for the record. I love the discipline of architecture, but I hate the profession of architecture. So I always feel like morally ambiguous about it to encourage you to stay with us, because on the other hand, I want to say, run away and go and do something much more productive with your life than become an architect. So I always have that kind of a dichotomy, because I really think architecture is not a difficult profession in the sense of the complexity of it. I think it's a really difficult discipline in terms the amount of commitment and knowledge and deep understanding that you need. And sometimes it's tricky and kind of deceiving in terms of how it works, because it have this kind of a playful attitude, especially when you are in the early stages of something like in making a meaning. But I think it's important for you guys, if you have any interest, to keep going, that you keep that spirit always alive. At least that's what we always try to do in our office. The other thing, which as a preface to this informal talk, not really lecture, is that it's incredibly important for us in a place like SCI-Arc that what we do in our offices and what we do here as teachers or running programs or whatever hat we have to wear, it keep a very fluid and relaxed relationship. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to show you, it has a very direct parallel life with the stuff I've been doing in SCI-Arc and mostly in SCI-Arc and in other places that I taught in the last 10 years. So part of the work is in direct relationship with the thing that I work with the students here, but also the discussion with colleagues and the collaboration with colleagues. Now, going more into the specific problems of the void, and the one that I like the most when I was looking at what really void means, you have to keep in mind I'm from Argentina, so still after 12 years in America, my English is not that sophisticated when it comes to these words. So the one I like the most about the void was a void check, which is basically when you don't have money in your bank and the bank rejects, so it becomes a void check. That I can relate. Now, in terms of the void of the problem of architecture, what I'm trying to, maybe there is a way to stretch it in terms of the work that we've been done in the office with this notion that Alexi was talking about the void and the black screen and so on. And it had to do with a couple of things that maybe, and take this with a grain of salt, they're maybe related to this notion of void that I think Alexis is referring to. We have to do with what I would like to think the notion of the autonomy or the autonomous quality of architecture and the work that we're interested to produce. What I mean by that is we make a huge, very evident effort to isolate what we work from any kind of external forces or external conditions. So it's not that we treat site or program or other condition as a pure void, but we try to imagine that there is a void there in which our project will start to relate and trigger a whole series of conditions. So I'm not so sure if this argument completely holds, but this is a way to start to think about in relation to that, and I would guess that that's probably the reason why Alexis put my talk in relation to that. I think it had to do with that notion, with one of those notions. So it's really important also for you guys to keep in mind when I show you some of the work that we produced in the last 10 years in the office is that by not any means I'm trying to present this to you guys like this is the truth about architecture, or this is the way that you should do architecture, is the only way. It's a way, and it's the way that we choose to operate and the choose that we work to work. And I realize that the void for me is a very comfortable place to be, because it's basically a place and you can choose to isolate other variables and you can choose to isolate what elements you work. Now, within that, when you manage to produce that frame of reference for your own work, basically, what I put here are 8 main, I would call it principles, but I think there are more episodes or chapters about what are the nature of the has to remain a permanent presence in terms of the interest of the work that we were trying to do, and how the things have been evolving into it. And very fast has to do with cinematics effects that have the capacity to produce desire. The idea of form follow forms, which is probably the one that is more close related to this problem of the void that we're talking about. So the principle that I've never been interested in form follow functions or anything like that. I've always been interested in the pure state of architecture, and for me the pure state of architecture relates to the problem of form. And then there is a couple of, I would say, more byproducts of a kind of a contemporary technology or a contemporary technique or a contemporary logics of work. They have to do with the problem of what I call the grotesque and the horrific as not new vehicles, but different vehicles for the production of beauty, which, if you're interested in the problem of form, and I would argue in relation to the problem of void, the problem of beauty is come to the front, to the forefront, to the main front. Now, the thing in relation to that, and in that sense, I'm in that sense, I would say I'm very classical kind of architect, even though you will find that surprising when you see the work. But because what I'm interested in are really the problems that architecture always has been interested in. But what I'm interested in is a high level of contamination that had to do with always to try to live in a kind of a presentness. I really believe that the most interesting architecture, I'm not arguing that mine is, but I argue that mine has a desire to be, it always happened in a kind of a state of presentness. It's not really about the past, it's not really about the future, even though we like to think that it's in those terms. At the end, you only can operate within the present. So there is a couple of other more specific and nerd things we have to do with the production of architecture in the last 20 years, more specifically. We have to do with what I would call a critical shift in terms of where the discourse and the main ideology of architecture has been moving from. One is historically geometry was the main vehicle for the production of form. One of my arguments is that with the current computation technology, image became the main vehicle for the production of form. Even when you're working at the geometrical level, line levels, and so on, you're working with the image of that, and you're not really working with the literality of that. The other one, which I found really interesting in my own terms, is the notion of editing versus the idea versus composition. Not that editing is totally different than composition, but it has a different logic than composition. It's less linear, it's less sequential, and you can move it around back and forth. And that has to do with, which I'm not going to get into that, we have to do more with the biographical, let's say, quality, which is, I originally wanted to be a filmmaker more than I wanted to be an architect. So there is a lot of desire that we work and operate more from the cinematic logic than come from the internal logic of architecture. But also I would argue that the techniques and technology developed in the last 20 years, it came from that logic. So it seems very comfortable. The other thing is, I'm completely obsessed, and obsession I think is a really important word, and I will say in relation to the problem of void as well. Because I really think if you have any interest to become an architect, you have to develop a sense of what will be your obsessions and what are the things that you want to obsess about. This is an important thing because at the end of the day, you're going to do this for the rest of your life every fucking day. Might as well make something that you obsess about it, and usually will keep you away from jail and other things, of other bad things that you can obsess about. But the problem of virtuosity is something that interests me. Pretty much any work that I pay attention to it is more often than not a work of virtuosos or virtuosity. I believe to be good, you really need to be a virtuoso. And I don't mean by that you're born with it. Virtuoso is something you can work and you can achieve and develop it. And the last part, I would say, which is the most interesting specific ambition, it has to do with what in the last 20 years has been defined as affect. But I want to be more specific, and what I'm interested in the notion of lust and arousal as a quality that can be related to architecture. Now, this, I'm just talking a lot on the front end, so then I can show you a bunch of images, more like a cartoon, and we can move fast through that. But I think it's important to try to clarify the frame where we operate. And the reason for that, I have a self-interest in that relation, because for those of you who are going to remain with us, or for those of you who want to come back later, you always have to keep in mind that our grad program is a thesis-based program. Meaning, at the end of the day, you decide to do it, you're going to have to do a thesis, meaning you need to start to define a level of clarity about what your work is about. So I'm trying to do this kind of exercise about my own work that I think it relates with the work of any interesting architect should aspire to do. Anyway, we'll get back to these issues fast. So the thing I was talking about, virtuosity, discipline and knowledge, void, isolating variables, and so on. So the work of somebody like Francis Bacon is really useful for me, and always, aside that I like it, that I emotionally connect to it, I always find conceptually really interesting, because the work of Bacon, unlike, let's say, Picasso, or unlike Duchamp, he was not so much more obsessed to produce a completely groundbreaking change of trajectory within painting, but he was working with inside the discipline and knowledge of painting and portrait in oil. So he was using very old techniques, trying to reconfigure a whole new cultural aesthetic sense. We're not going to get much into those details. I just want to give you some reference about what we think. The other problem has to do with the form follow forms, and they say the anomaly or the peculiar or awkward notions of form, and how you can control and manipulate the mechanism through which you can work on that. This is How to Lay Out a Croissant by Enrique Mirages, which in many regards was my hero and the architect I always aspired to be. And then this notion of grotesque and horrific and other qualities then come into play, and the notion to start to relate with a kind of a visceral quality, we'll get into that. But the last point I want to make as a brief introduction is this notion I was talking about, the problem of technique and the manipulation of that, and the cultural void in which you choose to operate within that. This is a movie from the 60s called La Jetée, which was basically a series of slides. But basically, what I'm trying to argue is, for me, conceptually, it's always important to have a theoretical or a critical framework you work, but at the end of the day, I think it's more important how you choose to do something, more than the conceptual frame. Meaning, La Jetée and 12 Monkeys of Terry Gilliam is basically the same movie. I mean, 12 Monkeys of Terry Gilliam is based on La Jetée, but it's completely different, completely cultural context, completely different techniques, completely different methodologies. So they are absolutely different films, even though the conceptual frame is the same. As I said, not that this is the only truth in architecture, but at least it's the one that I'm interested to work with. So I always been much more obsessed about the how than the what, about how you operate within architecture. That's a tricky thing, because then you realize at the end of that road that actually you were interested all the way from in the what. But it's much useful and productive to focus more on the how than obsess about the what, because that can paralyze you. Anyway, so the first episode and the very early stages of the work is what I call experiment, in which at that time, and I think it's important for you guys when you jump into the void or something like SCI-Arc, to understand the difference between experiment and research, or the experiment and evolution of the work. We use these words, experiments and research, like they're interchangeable. They're not. They're not the same thing. They don't mean the same thing. Experiment for me is when you shoot, not that you shoot in the dark, but you work in an isolate elements. Research is when you start to define a more clear agenda, so each thing that you start to manipulate start to aim into a much more clear goal. So, for example, what you guys doing in making a meaning, probably the first week, you feel like you're doing a series of experiments, but at the end of it, you're going to realize that you amount into a very clear sense. It's just at the early stages, you really don't know what you were doing. You're just trying to figure it out things. So this is the same with the early stages of the work, when we will get more and more involved using computers and computational tools. I don't think that discussion is that important anymore in this context. I think computers and those tools are a given. So we are in a really exciting moment in which ideas and critical thinking is at the forefront again. But if you set the clock back 10 years, at that time, it was much more important, in which the technique and the technology was becoming almost the ideology and the critical thinking. So how to operate within that territory, and how the notion of a singular surface or continuous surfaces and all that was a really important mechanism. So these early projects, as I said, they're more experiments because they didn't have a very clear specific agenda. Of course, you can read certain qualities that will start to merge. And the other thing which interests me a lot is something that I really literally stole from Enrique Mirashi, which is the idea to work in projects of architecture like autopsies. In the sense of you work in a project, then you figured it out what you did with that project, and that became the genesis for the next one. So one of the things that interests me a lot is to work with families, and I start to work with a series of concepts that can move from one to the other, which also when you work with computers, it became like a natural state of it. So out of all these series of experiments I show you quick, start to emerge a kind of a genealogy, or start to emerge a kind of a basic code of principles that we can start to use. And the other thing was that this condition of animation software and image that was obsessed, they became an opportunity to start to work with the notion of animation and motion in a much more specific way to start to develop an agenda. So I would say PS1, which is a competition that PS1 MoMA in New York, the Museum of Modern Art, with the, let's say, the experimental arm and PS1, they do every year. They invite young architects to do a competition. We got invited to do it in 2005. And the animation that you're seeing right now is animation that we present to the jury to open our presentation of the work. This was the first time that we fully engaged the cinematic conditions as an approach to architecture. Now, you're going to realize in most of our projects, until very recently, that there is a very kind of obvious desire of the black background and the void to really focus the energy on the power of the object, of the power of the architecture piece as the way that they will take over the whole thing. So in PS1, the cinematic effect was not to use animation as a way to represent the project, but to use animation and camera moving as a way to think the problem of the project and to operate. So the couple of ideas that were in play, I was looking at the time a lot in the first Alien by Ridley Scott, in which you never get to see the monster, you only see bites, because the horror is more horror, where you cannot put it all together in your head. So part of the argument for the project was that you will never fully understand the pavilion until you walk by, get into the museum, and look back. And there was something other interest, which at that time, which I still am interested in. I'm interested in porn movies of the 70s. I'm 41, so porn movies on the 70s were really important in my teenager years. But there's something interesting about the porn movies of the 70s too, which is at that time, they still were showing in movie theater, so they had to make a fake narrative to make it look like a legit movie, which really was only about sex. So I always felt like architecture is a little bit like that you build the whole apparatus that deceiving for the part that you really are interested in. So I made that joke to the director. Well, I didn't know there was a director of MoMA. At the time was a guy in a suit and whatever, and the guy looked at me and said, "Oh, you know our taste." So that was the moment that I thought, okay, fuck, we may win this thing. Then we're going to have to figure it out how we're going to build it. So, but in any case, the thing that it became very evident and apparent to me in this project was I realized that when we built the pavilion, that for me the render and the image was not a desire to project how the building will look, but I was much more obsessed that the thing that we built looked like the image. And that seems like a game of words for you guys, but conceptually for me it was like an amazing breakthrough because that was the moment that I fully engaged the artificiality, what I would call the void of working in the screen and so on, and became that as a parallel reality that you want to achieve and not so much as a representation. So those things start to become a much more organized thing. Then the other part is since you win until you open, you have basically 85 days to figure out how to build an entire budget. So Alexis came on board to work with us on this because basically he was the only one I knew that it was crazy enough they can help us to pull it off. So we were inventing and improvising as we were making up because the truth is, this is 2005, so it's not that far ago, but if you think about it in terms of technology and whatever, there was not a lot of knowledge about how to build one of the things in that time frame and so on. So we start to break it into multiple parts. Anyway, we built it, was there, and so on. But what is interesting about these ideas of autopsies is that you start to think about, if you focus on in these benches, we did those in LA in the dry weather of Los Angeles and whatever, so the material was done, but we were running against time, so those guys were very well done in Los Angeles, but when we got to New York with the humid summer, whatever, they start to develop blisters and bubbles in the paint, and Drew Parish, who fabricated that for us, was almost crying the morning and walking because it was not perfect. So it's okay, we did it, we put it, and Nicola Urosov, who was at that time the New York Times critics, came to see the piece, and he said, "Wow, that's great, you guys did that on purpose because you're into the grotesque and all that bullshit." And you say, "Oh yeah, of course." What you learn with that is the notion of evolution or growth, it never stops. So the project, you control certain aspects, but there are certain things that they have their own life, and that's something that interests me big time. So in any case, as I said, this autopsy evolutive logic is PS1 was the first one that we start to work with this idea of a singular cell that can keep multiplying and changing. And after that, we start to figure it out, okay, how far we can push that, how we can introduce a sense of continuity within variation in these things, and how we start to work with this problem on the grotesque and the horrific more on purpose. So another thing that we did was a solo show at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. So we took some of the principles that we figured out in PS1 and we take it into something else. So in this case, we accelerate the material compositions on purpose, so the blisters and bubbles will happen for real during the time that the exhibition will happen. So the other thing that I always been obsessed is I have no interest whatsoever in the ethics of the process of architecture. Architecture is a highly moralist discipline, if you haven't figured it out by now. And I always hate that part, this idea that the project is like a direct, obvious conclusion of a process. Don't get me wrong, we work in process, we work in systems and all that, but I'm never interested to reveal how that happens. I'm much more interested in kind of the magician logics of it. So every time that we get to do an exhibition or a solo show in museums and so on, we always choose not to do a pedagogical one, but much more to convey a series of sensibilities or affects or qualities that we want the project to start to operate within that. So this notion of the singular cells, multiplying variation, we keep working for that. We always work in 3 or 4 projects at the same time in the office. I have a tendency to get bored, so it's much easier for me to work in multiple projects, multiple scales. One of the things I find really fascinating about the computer logic is not that it's literal, it's not really scaleless, but they have like the void of the screen of that, it gives you a sense of a scaleless, which I personally find incredibly attractive and interesting to work with. Some other architects consider that criminal, But my personal take on the thing is a very interesting one, because it basically allows you to work on a series of principles of logic that you can scale up and down and go from a house to a product to an exhibition. This, for example, was a project for a guest house outside Paris. And this was the first one that, with the internal logic of these genetic codes and cell systems, start to work. It was the first one that we did, and we start to work with one cell and keep producing variation. We start to work with 3 different cells from the get-go. So the idea and the ambition was to start to produce a logic of a species instead of a logic of type or typology. It's not that the species for me is completely different than typology, but the difference is a species have the capacity to adaptate and change, and also a species needs of external factors of contamination to exist. So that principle interests me a lot. The other thing which was interesting about this particular project is that we start to work with a kind of a deceiving strategy of repetition. A lot of the things that you see there, they are the same pieces, but they're rotating and reorganized in particular ways. So it produces the effect that each of them are unique, even though they are not, which is something that I still find incredibly compelling and important in architecture. I know that there are 2 or 3 things that we try not to talk too much about in architecture school. One is the problem of originality. The other one is the problem of your own signature and your own individuality within that. And the last one is the problem of pure aesthetics evaluation of the work. These 3 things are things that I'm obsessed about it and things that interest me a lot. And I think, not that you can achieve it, but I think to have a genuine desire for originality is incredibly important in your work. Now, personally, I don't believe that architecture is capable to produce anything completely new. I think architecture, by definition, has the capacity to produce a high level of innovation, but it's never completely new, because you always, whether you like it or not, you're always in relation with a kind of a genealogy or a trajectory that your work belongs. So it's a really difficult thing to come to terms with that thing, that you're an individual and you're working in your own project, but at the same time, your project and your individuality actually is in sync with a bunch of other people that work in similar interests. So architecture, unlike art, has, even though we produce a lot of artistic effects and a lot of museum installations that are crossovers between architecture and art, we always think of this thing from the architecture point of view. And as I was saying, unlike art, architecture has an obligation to interact and communicate, and this is the problem with the void, is an interesting notion to work with. I think the void is a very useful logic to operate and to work, but the moment that the work gets out of there, it's outside the void. And you cannot control it, and it became something else, which personally I find fascinating. So part of the thing, this was for another a solo show at the MAC Museum in Vienna, in which this was the first attempt that we tried to captivate in a physical way these principles of animation and cinematic qualities and voluptuous and excessive quality that the work has into a physical thing. So the idea was, it's a long gallery we paint in black, and the show was called Pitch Black, like the very bad movie of Vin Diesel. I have a fascination for bad movies. I look at bad movies as popcorn movie for inspirations. I think Antonioni, Fellini, Berman, all those movies are great for your soul. I find it absolutely useless when it comes to work. I think Pitch Black, Hollow Man, vampire movies, zombie movies are great source of inspiration for our work. And I'm very interested in the low-end, high-end interaction between them. Anyway, so in this case, what we learned was that the body of the piece could be always the same, and to incremental variations of the legs, it can produce that effect of captivate motion and so on. So the other thing which is always interesting, that you keep learning, that's what I'm saying, is really important that you keep thinking of the work as a dynamic entity, they have a life of their own, is that even though the thing have like an art scale object, doesn't matter that you think like that. We're architects, and your brain is wired as an architect, and you think in an architectural way. So even though you have that condition, even though you work at the art or product design or any of the things that we will work on it, you always have an architectural logic. And all of these group of families work one interaction back and forth. And so in parallel, when we were doing the MAC exhibition, we were doing this little pavilion for the same house in France. And at the end, it didn't come out, as she didn't have enough money, so the pavilion became a bench in the garden. The house became a pavilion, the pavilion became a bench. So we were playing around with this idea of viruses and mutation and misfit. That was the first time we started to work on it, and we used scripting to produce the formation. So we were playing around with the canonic chairs of the IMS. And basically, we infiltrate this with virus. This thing is built. This is a real thing. It's not a render. It's a thing. And so we did this chair, and we designed this in 48 hours. And the Art Institute in Chicago liked it, and they commissioned us to do it, which is always a problem because you always get to build and fabricate the project that you care the less, and the one that you really like, they never go nowhere. So I freaking hate this chair. But we already sold like 4 of them, so it's keeping my office alive for the last year and a half. So you never know. My point is you have to pay equal level of love of attention to each project that you do because you never know which one will go ahead. So this one we were fucking around for 2 days and suddenly we fabricated. And the thing is, we make way more money in any of these pieces than with the fee that we get from projects. So, yeah. I don't know if you guys saw the car I drive. That thing paid for that car. So it's a good deal. So anyway, evolving in much more closer work, misfit becomes a much more contemporary problem, and I think it's not that we abandoning the notion of the boy, but I think we are challenging and we're trying to contaminate them. So the first of the series of species that we did of this, one thing that you have to, probably you noticed by them, I always say we because I think the work that we produce in the office with the team and the students, whatever, is incredibly important. And the thing that this notion of virtuosity and how the computer, this is a fact. And this is something that is important for you to learn that you guys for in architecture. No matter how good you are, you will become obsolete. So you cannot put all your eggs in the basket of the ideology of the technique and the technology you're doing because one thing is certain, the technology keeps changing all the time. So at one moment, you will wake up, go to your office, and you realize that everybody in your office and everybody in your studio and school are way better than you are with softwares and mechanism of that. So you need to have a very clear idea what you want to work on it and what are the things, because your team and your willingness to allow the team that work with you to contaminate and to bring new ideas to the table is absolutely crucial for the work to keep evolving. So architecture, no matter what, is always an act of collaboration. Even when you're working alone as a student, the guy sitting next to you, you don't know this yet, but later on you will see that people who are sitting next to each other, the project usually look alike. And the guy who's sitting 5 feet away, the project starts to look different. So there is a condition that the more open than you are to that, the more interesting your work will get. Anyway, the other thing which I will say is I have zero capacity to edit. So every project that we do, it has more stuff than the previous. So excessive quality and keep adding shit is the natural progression of things for us, which I will say that's a problem. I'm not saying that that's a virtue. It's a fact. It is what it is, and we move on. So in any case, this was an exhibition for John Lautner, which is a pretty original, interesting architect in LA. I never find it that fascinating, but it's a really interesting one. They invite 5 architects to take one of his canonic houses and add a 30%. So we got the Chemosphere house, which is a house that appeared in a couple of James Bond and Charlie Angel's movies as the house for the evil guy. But this is the evil of the 60s. So we thought it was not evil enough, so we add an armature to it. But these things that became, each of these exhibitions that we get invited to do, for me, became really interesting opportunities to set up different trajectories for the work. So this idea of the accumulated of what I would call it the prosthesis logic and the friction with recognizable conditions, it became a really interesting thing for us. So in the same time we were working for that, this was the first time Alessi, the Italian industrial design company, commissioned us to develop a cutlery set for them. And this was really the first time that we work in product design. It's something that I never pursued. I never have a business plan. We just work on the stuff that people ask us to work on it. And in that sense, I'm a very traditional architect. We don't self-generate projects. We do competitions and so on, but we always like to work with, this is an awful competition that we did for a tower in Dubai. It's probably the worst thing that we've ever done. But, well, that's how it goes. But product design became more and more like a regular feature in the office. So I'm interested in design work at any scale. almost when it's almost like an art piece for Selfridges in London, to when it's a product design for Alessi, or when it's a museum or a competition or a project, or another project for another installation for the Pompidou Center in Paris. So for me, the principle is how you start to move the nature of the logic that you're working with and this kind of a horrific monstrosity, science fiction quality that the works operate within that, and how you move from one scale to other, and how there are principles or families that you can develop at the same time. So at the same time that we were doing the the product design for Alessi or the exhibition, we were doing this competition for the media art museums in Spain. It was called Tabacalera because it was an old tobacco factory. And in this case, you can see that every layer that we keep adding, the level of sophistication, the level of complexity of the initial configuration keep adding more and more. But what was interesting about this project, and it was not by choice, but it became, so there was a series of projects at the time from the cutlery set to the Londoner to this one, and we start to work with existing conditions, one being the table, the other one the house, in this case, an old factory, and how the project start to do it with that. So I think we start to move slowly outside the void in the sense of I got more and more interested in the misfit and got much more and more interested in the friction and got much more interested in the dirtiness and the work to operate outside the computer realm of perfect balance. I think it had to do also with the natural maturity progression of the work. And so, this project became like the genesis, or I will say our more recent work, and we're going to go much faster. So we have time for questions, which I think at the end is more important than whatever mambo jumbo had to tell you guys. So there's a whole series of projects that we did based on that. This was another competition for a museum in Poland. And this one was the first one we started to reincorporate Platonic geometry, those circles, spheres that you see there. And it was a kind of interesting move because the moment you start to incorporate Platonic geometries, it became something that you can recognize and completely change the mood and the effect of the formal thing. So the thing that will have a much kind of a monster quality, it suddenly started to become more friendly because they have elements that you can relate to it. So based on that, we'll develop a second collection for Alessi, one that was a much more ambitious one in the sense that we tried to create a whole family of what we call instruments of manners. And what was interesting to me about this, aside the ornamental quality and the excessive quality that the work has and we are interested to keep developing, is this was the first one that for me became obvious that this chess was not about the pure autonomy of the object, but to use these objects, you will have to change the posture of your body, the movement of your body about how you start to operate. So you start to realize that the power of the excessive formalism also can start to affect social behaviors of movement and so on. So the thing started to remain less pure, it started to become more contaminated and more aggressive into that condition, and I think it became a much more interesting problem. I'm going to skip some of this animation because if not, it will take forever. So for me, this, which was a kind of a simple problem about doing a whole collection about wine stoppers and corkscrewers and another cutlery system, it became really almost like a design formal manifesto. Not a written manifesto, but some kind of a, we wanted to hint on something, that really the work can start to have a much more aggressive level of transformation on it. The level of obsession also in terms of the micro detail, and that's something that interests me a lot more and more, that you load the beginning of the project or the beginning of the cellular system with a lot of information, so that will produce a much more radical outcome. So instead to wait until the end to start to add layers, you start to incorporate more stuff at the beginning of it. But again, at the end of the day, the production of the horrific and the grotesque. But I would say this was probably the last project in which we were obsessed or working with what I would call the extreme sophistication or kind of almost the extreme virtuosity of formal geometry. So after this, when I thought that we hit the wall in terms of, I didn't know where to go and where else we can go in terms of that, even though there was a series of projects that came out of that, like this display system for the Venice Biennale, and then it became something else. A small installation at the MAC apartment here in Los Angeles, which we decided to make a structure out of flowers, and the flowers will die and change. So this was the one that we started to become much more aggressive, with the capacity of to work with things that will have the notion to change, but also to become dirty, to smell bad, to become disgusting, to become more raw end. But the other thing was that without thinking about this project, everybody started to talk about that this was like a Mexican cemetery of the future. So the notion of rituals started to become much more interesting to me. And competition that we did based on those principles. So I always have a big problem working with color. So I thought that this super intricate ornament geometrical structure that we do, if we start to allow plants and flowers to grow into it, and contamination and so on, it will be a really cool way to acquire color without working with color. Francesca, my husband, for the Thyssen-Bornemisza Art Contemporary Museum in Vienna, commissioned us a small pavilion museum for Patagonia, Argentina. This thing looks way bigger than what it is. It's roughly only 6,000 square feet. This was one version that it was in the Venice Biennale last year. Another kind of indirect collaboration with Alexis. Alexis was working in that pavilion, and we got to send this stuff. But anyway, let's jump fast. I don't want to show you this animation. So that was the project, but this was the one that really the whole notion of vegetation, contaminated. But I still felt like it was too happy and sophisticated. I don't know, like toopsy. I don't know. There was something about it that I didn't feel adequate to me. So I told her after we did all that, she paid for the animation, for the model, for everything. We said, you know what? I don't like the project. We're going to do another version. And we do it for free because you already pay for this. So this was the one that we sent to the Biennale with all the flowers, all that bullshit. I didn't like this one that much because I don't think it was aggressive enough in the level of misfit and contamination and transformation that I was interested to. So maybe it's because I'm getting old, older, not that I'm that old. This is one important lesson for you. You remain a young architect as far as you don't build much. So you don't build much, you can be an upcoming architect until you're 65. It's the only discipline I know that you can do that. But anyway, I don't know if I'm getting older or whatever because I have a daughter or whatever it was, that I start to become more connected with my own root and my own genetic code, being from Argentina and all that. So the notion of rituals plus RAF plus Pampas, it became something I started to obsess by it. And like many other things that happen to anybody in life, it happened almost by accident. There is a channel in Argentina called the Gourmet Channel, which is basically like the food channel here. So this guy here is Francis Malman. He was for many years one of the 2 or 3 most prominent, famous Nouvelle Cuisine chefs in Argentina. This guy, 5 years ago, something happened to him. I don't know what, divorce or whatever it was. And he went a little bit cuckoo. So he sold all his restaurants in Buenos Aires, and he bought a piece of land in Mendoza, in the desert part, and he started to do this TV show from the most rough areas in Argentina, and start to cook like gauchos in the 19th century. So cook the whole cow, cut it, all the rituals and cut and so on. And then he will mix it with the most sophisticated high cuisine sauces and so on. And I thought that that was a really compelling idea to start to work in the architecture way. So this is where we are right now. All the 4 projects I'm going to show you in the next 2 minutes is based on this. Then I start to look more carefully. That's what I'm saying, the obsession, you have to take it seriously, and then you have to commit to study the problem a little bit. I start to look a lot into the instrument of rituals of the gauchos from the 19th century, metal and silver and so on. So you have this combination, these super sophisticated, gorgeous, ornamented pieces that they use for very brutal things, to kill animals and to cut them and to peel them off in the most brutal way. And it was fun because at the same time I was working with this interest. Jason Payne, who had the installation here, which is a wonderful installation, also started to have an interest in rawhides and so on. So we were joking that we have a cow architecture movement starting at SCI-Arc. But mine is not really about the cow, of the animal itself. What I'm interested in is the obsession of the ritual of the killing and peeling and so on, but also the misfit between those 2 logics. The misfit that you can have something super sophisticated combined with something much more raw and primitive. So we developed, one of the experiments we were doing was this chair that we were developing for Vitra. It's not going to go into production. They probably will go to their museum as a one of a kind. And then the bench for France, I convinced the client to do this other version. so that it became almost like a mutilated carcasses, and a cow that has been killed in the most ruthless way. But all the drawings and all the things that you need to do as an architect to prove and to figure it out that you can build it. And that this is how we want, this is the thing that we want to do for them in France. This one is now in production, and hopefully we have it installed by January. So I'm going to show you in a moment how it's supposed to look in her house. Oops, that was too quick. So that's how it's looking in the house. So the last two things I'm going to show you, this is the new version of the Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum. This is in Patagonia, in Argentina. So I thought that we should go all the way out with these ritual notions and so on, but also incorporate the Platonic forms, and to start to incorporate the notion of the ritual, of the logic, of not at the site as a reference to the site. We still keep treating the site and those things as a void, but start to use it in our favor to start to develop some kind of a fictional relationship to what we do. And I don't know if we're going to ever make this one or not, but we're trying to get it done. The really cool about this is, well, I'm obsessed with it. It has to be built with very conventional and primitive construction techniques. So the thing, it will become way more imperfect than it is here, and that fascinates me. Unlike many of my colleagues who are interested in a similar line of work with the technology, I don't have an obsession with the fabrication technology. We use it when we need to use it, but when we can, we use some other thing. I'm obsessed with what are the qualities and the conditions of the work produced at the end of the day. That's something that also for me was a really interesting learning curve from Enrique Mirages. Most of the project that he made in his early stage of his career, the one that made him the guy he became, they were all public projects, and they were done with very low budget, and they were built with very bad construction companies. So when you go to see them in person, they're actually very poor constructed. They're not the perfect tip-top Frank Gehry titanium thing. They're very rough, but that makes it even way more compelling. So there is something about that problem of the sophistication of the production, of the thinking of it, and the unsophistication that there's no way to avoid that architecture when it's built does, because you have too many pieces, so there's no way that you can keep that level of uniformity that comes from the screen. So even if this project doesn't happen, this project allows us to engender a whole series of other elements that we are working right now into production. One is I'll show you in a second. One is, well, these are more close-ups of that pavilion. One is a porcelain lamp that we're doing for a company in Limoges in France. It looks like a little cow. Well, not really a cow, more like a mutant. So this one is right now in the prototype phase. It was supposed to come out to the market next March. And I think it's going to be so expensive. They're not going to even give me one. And this is the latest version that we're doing for Alessi. We showed them to them a couple of months ago. This is the one that we got into production after many years of work. One is a bottle opener. The other one is a wine stopper. You haven't seen this, Alexi. This is new stuff. This is a chandelier, but they had to design very specific candles for it. And this is a paperweight. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is, at the end of the day, you set up your obsessions, and then you run wild with it. So there is a kind of a logic. I mean, many of the things I'm trying to talk to you guys, it sort of makes sense today as a talk, but it's not like you're thinking in these terms every time in your office. When you're working on it, you're working on it, and you immerse yourself in the logic while you're working on it. To a point, the project and the logic of the project dictate the principle that you want to follow, and let them to guide you through it. So at the end of the day, what you have to figure it out is a way to navigate about those things. And in a way, you have to be careful that the obsession became like a blueprint. And the void is a good territory to put your obsession in place to it, but you have to be careful that the obsession doesn't become the void. These were the boxes for the prototype anyway. And the paperweight, unfortunately, I don't have pictures of the prototype here, but the paperweight, we did like, I don't know, like 4 different versions for it. That is a US Constitution. No, that's in the Declaration of Independence. I thought the idea that it was cool to put the. In these days, it seems like you need to have a paperweight to keep it together. The wine holder, the white stopper, another paperweight. But in any case, all of these were coming out of this, and this is where the work is right now. And it's not really completely figured it out. This is the current state of things, and I always like to finish a lecture with this clip.
Trust me, everything's gonna be fine.
Everything's gonna be fine.
You met me at a very strange time in my life.
And you met me in a very strange time of my life. Anyway, that's how I did. That's it. Thank you. If you want. Yeah. Oh my God, you're running tight ship, microphones and everything. I remember 5 years ago we were doing in the Mac Lab.
What kind of role does the space between the form play in the creation of the form?
That's something that, another of the things that I stole from Mirages. For me, the space is always a consequence of what you're working with. I mean, I never think, I know that it's kind of a weird thing to say in discussion of architecture. I never really think in terms of a space. I always interested in that the space is a consequence of the other element. So the space always emerges and we always look into it, but it's never, we never make any design decision based on the space. Because I'm convinced that when you work with this kind of logic and this aggressiveness, the space quality will remain fairly interesting. But there is other aspect to it, what I will say is more like a genetic thing, which is, I was educated, I did my bachelor, what I was called here a bachelor in Argentina, which is a 6-year career architecture. You go from 18 to 24, 25. It's a 6-year thing. And it's way more intensive in terms of technical knowledge and programmatic function and structural rigor than the one in America, let's say. So I always assume, I never think that much about those terms because it's built into my DNA. Like, I know it's there, even though I'm not thinking about that. It's like, that's the reason why I'm not talking much about program. It's not that I don't care, it's just I was educated in a way that I know how to enter, where the bathroom should go, where the stairs should go. So those things for me come naturally. So the condition of the space is, out of that training, out of that practice, I know that the space will be there and it will have certain qualities, but I don't need to work on that as the main problem. As I said, it's not that it's the only way to work. So I'm much more interested in that the space became almost like a byproduct of other series of relationships.
Do you do any like modeling or prototyping to kind of just see how it feels to be inside some of these more?
No, but I know how it does. I think it's a very valid question. What I'm saying is, to me, it's one of those, for me, it's one of those things that always is a little bit deceiving. I personally think that when you work as an architect, your elements of work is not really, honestly, I don't think it's a space where you work with. What you work is with the geometry organizations, the one that produce the space. So when I think you're absolutely right. You always have to be thinking about that. I'm just saying thinking about that is being in control of your craft knowing that the space would emerge out of the control that you have. My experience of, I mean, I didn't show that, but before that, I built a couple of things in Argentina and so on, so we have a certain experience of that. It may be wrong, but sometimes sorry, it's my wife testing me. I have to go to the doctor, so she's waiting for me. Okay. So, anyway.
And then just a comment on that regard, which I think that when you actually see the full lecture and kind of like on the breadth and span of all of the animations that you create as part of your work, I think that's a very particular and personal way of understanding, I mean, like how something feels or how something works and so on. I think that also kind of how you build the deception. I mean, kind of in a way, it becomes kind of like as proprietary as the form itself. And I think kind of one of the things that belongs to your work has to do with like defining that trajectory of movement through an object, which is as defining as kind of like the single point of view. So would you be able to kind of like synthesize that? I mean, the idea of movement through an object and how that informs the work?
To me, it's going back to, for me, space is movement. So I like to think that through the movement that we do through animation and so on is the way that we read the space, that it will emerge of some of these things. It just happened also that the problem of movement for me is, that's what I'm saying, I don't think you can separate your own biographical desires with the consequence of the work. For me, the idea of movement has to do much more with the frustration that I have sometimes with architecture, that architecture doesn't move. But also there's something about, and I could, again, this is one of the things I always, I'm not so sure if I want to say or not in front of young students of architecture, because this is, this talk is more, I'm not talking about SCI-Arc graduate chair thing, I'm talking more about me as a designer. I personally think that you as an architect, through movement and so on, this is the part that you control the work. When the work that gets out of your hands, it becomes something else, and usually it's never what you think was supposed to be. It always becomes something else. So honestly, I have no way to know if the space will feel in the way I think it will feel, or how through motion and all that we try to set it up. You just try to give some kind of a sense of how to operate within that. And that is one of the things that, for example, I know that Alexis and I, we have a totally different approach in those things. Like, he's very hands-on and so on. I am completely hands-off about, for example, the construction process. It's not only because I don't like it, which I don't like it, I don't like to get dirt and all that, but also I don't like it conceptually. I personally think my role as an architect is to think on the problem as an intellectual abstraction mechanism. So I never think that we make buildings. I always think that we make drawings that somebody else will make buildings out of it. And I think both approaches are valid. I don't think one is more right than the other ones. I just say, at the end of the day, you are what you are, and you're wired in a particular way. So my advice in relation to that, my obsession with motions and defining to that, is because I think that this is what when the work belongs to me. And I will say many of these animations, we don't even show it to the client sometimes. They're more for us. They're more like for somebody else study models. Because sometimes you show it to the client gets deceived by it. And sometimes we use it, sometimes we don't use it. But they're more a mechanism of design. It's not so much a mechanism of representation or presentation. It's much more a way to think about it, and allows me to have a high level of detachment for the work, which I personally find incredibly important. I know it's a strange thing, but for me it's really important, and I need to feel that the project doesn't completely belong to me. That's why I think the void of the computer, that's why I'm so into computers and it fascinates me. It's not because I allow you to do all this weird thing, which is super cool, but also there's a kind of a fundamental distance. Like I really, and I don't have it here, but I can show you one day if you want. I was and I am still a super talented hand drawing kind of guy, and I was really good at doing physical models, but I do everything in my power to don't do any of that. And it's not because I don't like it, it's because for some reason I need that detachment. And I think animations and motion is kind of the ultimate level of detachment. And for example, models, we don't make study models in the office. We only make models when they are for an exhibition, the client pays for it. And I don't even take pictures of them. Like, I couldn't care less. I mean, the guy called me in the office, hey, we have the model we painted. You want to come and see it? No, it's okay, just send it. It's a strange thing I cannot really fully explain in a rational way, but that's how my brain works.
That's rational enough.
Yeah.
Any last questions? I know that Hernan has to
No, it's
go.
okay. We can do two
You got
more.
a couple of minutes? You guys have a question?
Yeah.
Could you talk a bit more about your view that form follows form and how you came?
Sorry, what?
Could you talk a bit more about your view that form follows form and how you came to that view?
It's one of the things that I think you develop an intuition about something. I think intuition, a couple of things in relation to that. You will hear a lot, if you keep going in architecture education, a lot of people tell you, oh, that's arbitrary. For me, arbitrary is fine. Everything in life is arbitrary. What is wrong is random. You cannot work in a random way. Arbitrary, you always make arbitrary decisions. So at any given time, what you do is an educated guess about what you want to work. So the form is not like I was 20 years old studying in Argentina and come to the conclusion. It was, you keep working, you have an intuition, you keep developing a logic, and suddenly one day you start to figure it out that your work has a certain pedigree and it has a certain genealogy, and you start to look around and you start to pay attention to people who are smarter than you, who are working on the problem, and you start to understand principles of things. So for me, the form came as a byproduct of the architects I was interested in looking when I was younger, from Mirages to Eichmann to Zaha Hadid to Wolf Priggs. They were all people obsessed with the problem of form. Or high-level extreme formalism, Frank Gehry, and you start to figure it out that they all have a certain roots, mostly in the Renaissance, that they have to do with that principles of it. And if you start to look historically, the trace, what makes architecture with capital A cultural activity, is that level of the form quality, not the function quality. The function is really, in my view, is really a late 19th century capitalist invention. It was not really rooted in the deep ontology of what architecture is. I mean, if you look through history, architecture with capital A, there were church and palaces and whatever. Function was not really a big deal at the time because basically architecture with capital A only happened in a certain level of it. So the other one for me became more not that that doesn't matter, but my point is, my obsession with architecture, a disciplinary thing, for me is embedded in that historical tradition. That's what I was saying. In a twisted way, I have a very classical sense about that notion of architecture. For me, the form follow form is not really a big discovery or anything like it. It's for me what architecture always has been. It's architecture talking to architecture. Now, specifically in the more contemporary discourse, probably Peter Eichmann was the one who argued for most of that as a main figure, but also I would argue that people like John Hediock and Cooper Union and Raymond Abraham, with somebody like, I don't think they never said it in those terms, like Eichmann did it, because he was much more obsessed in writing and so on than these other guys. But there was a whole pedigree about the purity of the discipline and why architecture was hijacked as a commerce or as a craft more than as a high-end cultural discipline. Like art, music, and whatever, they're all autonomous. Music talks to music. Art talks to art, and so on. Architecture was the only one that started to talk about something else. So Eichmann and some other guys, which I subscribe, they tried to reivindicate the role of architecture. Architecture with capital A, the architecture that matters as a cultural critical discipline, it had to be like that to remain pure about their own ontologies and own problems. And as I said, it's not the only one, because I think somebody like Ren Kolha has done extraordinary, amazing work with a completely opposite standoff, like architecture is a byproduct of external forces and so on. So there's no one way, but I think it's always important early in your career to make that kind of a basic decisions, like, are you interested in form, or we don't talk about those things anymore, but in the way I was educated in Argentina, basically you belong to, either you were a formalist or you were a functionalist. And there's something about that simplicity that I like. Then you try to build it into something else. But also I like the level of freedom that it gives me, because I think it suits me well, because I don't like to deal with clients, I don't like to deal with the real world much. So to create that void for yourself, it became instrumental too. So. Okay then. Good luck.